The biggest risk that weightlifters take when megadosing growth hormone in the short term is the incredible increase in water retention that they have. And I'm going to tell you why in this video. Before we move on, if you like these types of videos, please give it a thumbs up, comment on the section below, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Let's begin. Generally, my concerns with growth hormone treatment in healthy adults have been regarding mainly two issues. One is this concept of the Hayflick limit in cell division that occurs in the body. You see, our cells in the body can commit what's called hyperplasia, which means one cell can divide into two cells, about 40 to 60 times in our lives before they reach what's called the Hayflick limit, sort of like a dead end in cell division. When cells reach this limit, they either have to commit apoptosis, which means they die, or they become what's called senescent cells. Senescent cells cause the secretion of pro-inflammatory cytokines from our immune system. And in that sense, senescent cells cause inflammation, pain, and so on later in aging. So because of this fear of senescence, which probably is one of the reasons that you see people who watch this channel who regularly follow bodybuilding or powerlifting will notice that weightlifters tend to look much older than they are. One of the reasons I believe is the senescence. The second concern that I've generally had about using growth hormone in healthy adults is the concern about cancers. Specifically, when you have growth factors upregulated in your body, they don't just cause cells to divide and grow, but rather they also protect cells from death. And generally this sounds like a great thing unless your cells are damaged and incentivized to divide and grow while they're damaged. A recipe, I think, for cancers. So these have been my two general concerns with using growth hormone at even moderate doses in adulthood. You see, as you guys may know, once you reach, essentially it seems past the age of when you should be having children, so around between the age of 20 to 30, growth hormone levels in healthy adults exponentially decrease going from there onwards. So seems to be not supposed to have higher growth hormone levels when we're not at the age of having children at the very least. Not even past sexual maturity, but a bit past that. That's when it really declines. But there's another concern when it comes to megadosing growth hormone. The way bodybuilders and powerlifters do, especially powerlifters in the super heavyweights and bodybuilders in general. I'm talking about people using more than 6 units of pharmaceutical growth hormone a day, something like that. The concern there is this issue of edema and water retention. You see, the two concerns I brought up earlier, senescence and the issue of cancers, should be more concerns for people after the age of 50. But the interesting thing is that people who traditionally naturally have high growth hormone levels, they're called acromegaly patients. Those people tend to die in their 40s. Originally, it was mostly that they died from heart disease, although recently, interestingly, cancer seems to be overtaking heart disease in the deaths of untreated acromegaly patients. But nonetheless, they die earlier than you would think somebody would die from cancers or senescent cells usually, and they die specifically from heart disease. Now, about water retention, acromegaly patients were shown in an early study that was later confirmed by other studies to hold about 56% of their body weight in water, while healthy patients had about 50% of their body weight in water, so 6% difference. Interestingly, the acromegaly patients hold about 20% of their body weight in extracellular water, while healthy patients hold about 15% of their body weight in extracellular water. So the majority of the increased water that acromegaly patients have is extracellular. And this extracellular water is thought to play a causal role in the soft tissue swelling that is common in acromegaly that causes, it seems to be, organ hypertrophy, as well as changes in the facial structure of acromegaly patients. As well, it's also thought to be, the water retention is thought to be causal in their early mortality. Specifically, the water retention increases left ventricular hypertrophy, is thought to play a causal role in their hypertension and in their impaired diastolic function. Now let me give you two examples that those of you who have megadose GH for weightlifting will probably be familiar with. One is this idea of people developing carpal tunnel syndrome from GH abuse or when they naturally have acromegaly. It turns out we don't develop carpal tunnel syndrome. This is a very interesting subject to me personally because back in the day we used to be told that the growth, if the growth hormone you're getting is real, if you megadose it you should get this carpal tunnel syndrome. I used to think that this was because of growth hormone's direct effects on connective tissue. It turns out there is no carpal tunnel syndrome that comes from growth hormone abuse. In fact, it's actually an edema of the median and ulnar nerves that's causing this pressure on the nerves that cause you to develop the symptoms of carpal tunnel syndrome, which is not actually carpal tunnel syndrome. So in fact, actually the literature, academics in the literature note that there have been a lot of unnecessary surgeries for carpal tunnel syndrome in acromegalic patients. The solution is actually to hold less water and salt, not to have a surgery, of course. Another example is myocardial edema. You guys will probably have seen this more. Myocardial means regarding the heart, and edema is water retention, severe water retention. You guys will probably have seen this before and not realized you saw it. Have you ever seen an interview of a bodybuilder who is low body fat but is out of breath while speaking, while seated? This is often an example of myocardial edema. Interestingly, the myocardial edema that's common in people with acromegaly is immediately reversed upon successful treatment of the growth hormone excess. Now, the mechanisms by which growth hormone causes water and salt retention the mechanisms are not completely understood, and some studies are a little bit contradictory on individual elements of it, but briefly, and this is not the subject of the video, of course, but briefly, there are a few mechanisms that are known to take place with growth hormone. One is that growth hormone increases the activity of what's called the sodium glucose cotransporter 1, which returns sodium from the kidneys back into the bloodstream as well as glucose. It is also known to increase the activity of the epithelial sodium channel, which is called ENaC. This is a particularly prominent effect that it has. And it's thought to have effects on the RAS system, the renin-angiotensin system, and on aldosterone, but studies are a little bit contradictory on that subject. It activates ENaC specifically through STAT5, which is one of growth hormone's primary signaling pathways downstream, and it activates the sodium glucose cotransporter 1 via JAK2, the Janus kinase 2 pathway, which is downstream to growth hormone also. Interestingly, by the way, the Janus kinase 2 pathway, JAK2, actually deactivates ENaC. So there are opposing effects of growth hormone on ENaC, but it seems that overall the STAT5 effect wins out. Anyway, this is not so important. The point is that there are many mechanisms by which growth hormone increases sodium retention. They are direct. They have direct impacts on the kidneys as well as on systems that guide our biology in general. And interestingly, testosterone co-administration seems to worsen everything significantly. Androgens directly stimulate the renin-angiotensin system as well as ENaC, the endothelial sodium channel. And in addition, when androgens aromatize, they inhibit plasma antidiuretic hormone and stimulate hepatic angiotensinogen. Interestingly, the way that testosterone stimulates GH secretion is via an estrogen-dependent mechanism as well. But anyway, the point here is basically this. Testosterone also causes more water retention, both via the androgenic signaling as well as via its aromatization into estrogen. And so growth hormone, when you combine it with testosterone, also have additive effects on water retention. So basically, people abusing growth hormone as weightlifters have an incredible amount of water retention, and this water retention itself directly hampers the function of the heart, and in the long term seems to be extremely damaging to the heart. Now, obviously, a natural approach is probably not just sodium restriction, because sodium restriction increases aldosterone levels, and you need some sodium for lifting, especially if you're a serious athlete and so on. So what's the solution to this extreme water retention that seems to be causal in heart failures that occur among acromegalic patients? Well, I don't know if there really is a solution, but what I wanted to suggest in this video is what I consider to be what seems to be a low-hanging fruit. So the use of traditional diuretics all year when you're retaining a lot of sodium to get you to excrete that sodium may be a potential path that you may take. People have done that before with things like hydrochlorothiazide and so on. But there's also a less effective, maybe at the standard doses, but may potentially less dangerous approach. So technically, if you use a diuretic, you may make yourself dehydrated, or the worst possible thing that you can do for your kidneys is to dehydrate them. It's even worse than having high blood pressure. So there's a little bit of a risk there for people, especially that can't judge easily by sight whether they're holding a lot of water or not. On the other hand, there have been a new class of drugs introduced in the last decade called SGLT2 inhibitors. These are drugs that inhibit the action of the sodium glucose cotransporter 2. That's not the one that's increased by the effect of growth hormone, but another one. So let me describe what this class of drugs are and why they may be particularly attractive to people that are abusing growth hormone, either as super heavyweight weightlifters or as bodybuilders. Now, what the sodium glucose cotransporters are is that your body takes out glucose and sodium from your bloodstream into your kidney. These sodium glucose cotransporters, the SGLTs, return the glucose and sodium back into your bloodstream. Now, a very selective SGLT2 inhibitor, what that will do is inhibit the majority of the function of the sodium glucose cotransporter 2, allowing a little bit of the function to go from the sodium glucose cotransporter 2 back to the sodium glucose cotransporter 1. The sodium glucose cotransporters have slightly different effects, and there's a reason for wanting it to be highly selective over the sodium glucose cotransporter 2. However, what these things are is they basically cause your body to be able to return less glucose and sodium back into your bloodstream. And they were invented for diabetics. The purpose was to increase what's called glucoseuria, which means sweet urine, peeing out glucose. Because historically, managing blood sugar levels for diabetics has not turned out so well. Really, it's quite interesting because after the introduction of insulin, it was shown that diabetics who tightly control their blood sugar levels, compared to those who don't tightly control it with insulin, lived about the same age. The ones who didn't tightly control it, of course, developed blindness and lost their limbs and so on, but they lived about the same age. So tight blood sugar control didn't really extend life in diabetics. And this was a big mystery in the study of diabetes. The reason it seems to be was probably because insulin is such a harmful hormone in later life, and being hyperinsulinemic is actually so harmful that it outweighs the tight blood sugar control. The SGLT2 inhibitors were able to lower blood sugar levels by causing people to pee out their blood sugar, but they also extended life, unlike insulin's tight blood sugar control. So these drugs were very interesting. Now, originally the concern about these drugs was that this changing the function of the kidney, forcing it to urinate out forcing the body to urinate out glucose and sodium may be harmful for the kidneys. Initially, researchers didn't know if it would be harmful or not. Surprisingly, the sodium glucose cotransporter inhibitors turned out to be the second medication in history that could slow down the progression of chronic kidney disease, other than hypertension medications. So after blood pressure medications, this group of medications were the most kidney protective medications in history. In fact, just this morning, I was reading a paper about using SGLT2 inhibitors to prevent or to protect against acute kidney injury. So these medications cause you to urinate out sodium and glucose. They cause you to lose a bit of water weight, and they definitely protect your kidneys. And they also, depending on the medication you choose, see, if you choose empagliflozin or dapagliflozin, I use empagliflozin myself, those two are very selective of the SGLT2. But canagliflozin is less selective. And for that reason, it seems to be more anti-inflammatory in some studies. It inhibits the sodium glucose cotransporter 2 with the same impact as empagliflozin, but it inhibits SGLT1 10 times more. So that may be a particularly attractive medication for people using high-dose growth hormone. And especially, by the way, this is all even more interesting because when you use growth hormone, you make yourself acutely insulin resistant. So you make yourself hold higher blood sugar levels as well. So these class of medications may have a dual benefit for people megadosing growth hormone. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now, guys. By the way, about canagliflozin, I didn't mention, but it is associated with higher incidences of lower limb amputations among diabetics. I'm not exactly sure why. You can look into the pharmacology yourself to decide if under a doctor's supervision you'd like to use canagliflozin or empagliflozin. But nonetheless, these probably will not be enough, these SGLT inhibitors will probably not be enough to outweigh the harm of the extreme sodium retention that comes with megadosing GH, but they're a step probably in the right direction, and probably somebody could combine them with another diuretic to remove the majority of the edema that's concerning in the cardiovascular structure. I hope this was beneficial for you guys. I know people have talked about water retention with growth hormone before, but I think this is the first video that posits that the water retention from growth hormone is probably the primary reason that we see increased incidences of heart failure or heart attacks in weightlifters in their 40s since the introduction of growth hormone. I don't think it's growth hormone's impacts on cell division, senescence, apoptosis, or cancers, but the actual water retention that's so dramatically more harmful than just using androgens. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for bearing with me. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you guys soon.